Welcome back to the stage of history, young historians. In Chapter 20, we leave the West behind and head to Asia, the land of the rising fun. You see what I did there? Because Japan's like the land of the rising sun, so this would be... forget it. Alright, puns out of the way. A topic for Chapter 20 is the East Asian world, with the textbook highlighting three kingdoms, China, Japan, and Korea, and also throwing a little bit of ink to a few others, such as Thailand and Burma. Although I use the word kingdom here, there is a question as to what we should be calling these things. A kingdom is really any chunk of territory that's ruled over by a monarchy, but a nation state or a country starts to imply that the people of that territory are unified and connected and share certain cultural, linguistic, ethnic backgrounds. If we're talking about Europe in the 16th century, then it's almost unquestionably right to call anything that we have been studying there a kingdom because of the strength of individual local cultures and local rulers. Really, nowhere in Europe becomes a state or a nation until either the reign of Elizabeth gives some of those traits to the English, or until Louis XIV, the same for France. In China, though, there had been a good number of rulers who had brought about the type of unification dating back to the Yuan dynasty. So the term nation might apply for a full 600 years earlier to China than anywhere else. The difference in political administration will be one of our in-class topics next week, but for right now, we'll just keep it easy and we'll stick to the phrase kingdom, we'll stick to empire as our terms that we'll use to refer to these things, and we'll make the abrupt shift to nation, country, coming up in the next couple of chapters. I just wanted to preview a little bit of what is implied by that shift in language. Throughout my history of teaching East Asia's history, I've always kind of jumped back and forth on what it is I want to highlight from this early modern time period. This time around, though, I've chosen two items that I feel are both interesting and tie into some of the larger themes that we've had in class so far this year. For China, and for Chapter 20, Lesson 1, which focused on the Ming and Qing dynasties in China, or dynasties if you are going to be as British about it as our honors module was, I want us to focus on a figure who was, not unlike Johannes Gutenberg, hidden from history for a while after his death, only to re-emerge as one of the more noteworthy figures of the 15th century. That figure is Chinese Admiral Zheng He. Hopefully, in highlighting Zheng, we'll also touch on a few questions of race and religion as well. For Chapter 20, Lesson 2, and Japan, you know I used to do how to defend yourself against a samurai attack, but given the distinct drop in wild samurai ambushes that I've seen in our upper school in recent years, I think that I'm going to focus on something a little bit more different. Let's focus on some art and some culture. In particular, we'll take a look at kabuki theater. Why kabuki? Well, because kabuki does something that's very important to do in history. It shows us a connection between two different worlds, while also showing us just how distinctly different they are. England and Japan, two mass societies and two itty-bitty islands. So they're going to need to deal with the question of how to entertain urban populations before many other cultures. How do they do it? Well, during this time period, both of them start to develop a very distinct form of theater, with Shakespearean theater developing in England and kabuki theater developing in Japan. And while both will have men playing women, and while both will develop indelible cultural icons, the two experiences were actually quite different when it comes to a very important question of social class and socioeconomic standing. I'm going to ask you guys to think about that a little bit when we get that slide, but let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 20, Lesson 1, the Ming and Qing dynasties, and talk about Zheng He. Admiral Zheng He of China has one of the most curious backgrounds of any figure that we will look at this year, and I'm going to need to go back and cut. Sweet. Admiral Zheng He of China has one of the most curious backgrounds of any figure we'll look at this year. Born in 1371, Zheng was a Chinese Muslim and part of the Hui ethnic group in China. Since this is our first foray into China as a class this year, let's take some time to highlight some of the implications of that. While our tendency in the West is to view Chinese as being both a nationality and an ethnicity, China is actually a nation that contains multiple ethnic groups. There is a major ethnic group, the Han, which make up something like 90% of China's current population, but there are and were ethnic minorities. One such group is the Hui, a group of Chinese Muslims. Now, sometimes being an ethnic and religious and cultural minority puts one at odds with the powers that be, and this was the case for young Zheng. Somewhere around the age of 10, he was in a situation where he backtalked a Ming official and pretty quickly found himself captured and forced into serving a Ming prince. The Prince of Yan, the prince located in the emerging city of Beijing at the time. The prince, who would ultimately actually go on to become the future Yongle Emperor. While this attachment to the Yongle Emperor would be one of the things that propelled Zheng to greatness, I will also mention that he went through other punishments for his insolence as well. In particular, one that would cause him to go without having children at any point in his life, and which can make it confusing to choose a pronoun to describe him. Perhaps it's just best if we'll stick to calling the Admiral Zheng, then. Now, Zheng's rise in the Navy, or rise came through the Navy and through the defense of the man who would ultimately become the third Ming Emperor, the Yongle Emperor. And that was against the predecessor of the Yongle Emperor, the Jinwen Emperor. But Zheng's significance comes from his role as an explorer. From 1405 through 1433, Zheng went on 7 major voyages, each one with a gigantic treasure fleet, and each one returning with the riches of the Pacific world. Now, there are some scholars that dispute just how far Zheng's voyages went. We can confirm that he went pretty much everywhere of consequence in East Asia, the Middle East, the east coast of Africa. Where scholars start to fight is that there are a minority of scholars who have begun to theorize that Zheng may have even sailed as far south as Australia, or as far east as the west coast of North America. Quite frankly, these scholars who claim this are probably wrong, and both of these claims should be heavily doubted. They're based on documents that don't emerge until centuries later, but the fact that these things are claimed tell us at least 2 things. Number 1, not much was past Zheng in terms of seafaring. The idea that he could have reached the west coast of the modern United States and sailed back to China like it was no big deal seems realistic to at least some of the historians who have studied him. But number 2, given how doubtful those claims actually are, is it brings up that the historical record on Zheng, not unlike the historical record on somebody like Johannes Gutenberg, has some gaping holes in it because there was a long time period where he wasn't studied, where he wasn't seen as being a major figure in Chinese or world history. We don't even exactly know when it is that Zheng died. It's either in 1433 or 1435, and there wasn't much in the way of scholarship about him until 1904. When there's a long gap in the histories there, that's when you can get a figure where there's enough ambiguity for people to make some rampant speculation. It's just that for Zheng, most of that speculation is good, and for Gutenberg, a lot of that was speculation that he was, in league with the devil and printing books with children's blood. I'm sure you remember that. There are some confirmable things about Zheng, though. There are some things that we can say for certain, and one of them is that the guy certainly traveled in style. Seen here is what Zheng's flagship looked like, except, not a model and not in the middle of a mall food court, but that is a model built to scale there. And you see that lifeboat off to the side? Yeah, that's a scale model of Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria. God, what I wouldn't give to have history be just a little bit different and to see Columbus's face if he ever saw that pull up alongside him. Zheng traveled in fleets of these huge ships because his voyages were meant to obtain cargo and trading goods from the other locations that he visited. Although it's worth pointing out that unlike the Spaniards or the Portuguese or the Dutch, who were fixated on securing gold and silver in the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and securing at least things that were of defined value for the Dutch when they were more interested in spices and trade goods, Jung was more than willing to explore some of the cultural and biological oddities of the places that he explored, as seen here in this, my favorite drawing ever. I've got more that I could say about history's greatest sailor, so we might hit on him in class too, but here's the Zheng takeaways. The traditional Western history narrative towards China is that it was a kingdom full of people who were ethnically and culturally the same and wanted to keep to themselves, shielded from the outside world. Zheng, a Chinese Muslim who will then dabble in a few other religious beliefs over the course of his life, and then explore an entire hemisphere, should hopefully challenge these preconceived notions for us. From China then to Japan, where I want to conclude this video by putting a few thoughts in your head about kabuki theater, a form of theater which became popular in Japan during the 1600s. There's some debate as to whether or not kabuki theater should be called kabuki theater or just kabuki, given that the name comes from a Japanese term for song and dance. Saying kabuki theater might just be as redundant as saying acting theater, but we'll use kabuki and kabuki theater somewhat interchangeably. You read a little bit about kabuki in the text, including the ultimate ban on females being involved in theater because they were giving the menfolk all sorts of mischievous ideas. I just want to highlight some of the things that made kabuki unique. If you take a look at this image here, we actually get a good encapsulation of a number of unique traits of kabuki theater. One of the first things you might notice is that the staging is certainly unusual. There's this flower path that goes right through the stage, or the flower path stage that goes right through the audience, rather, and this path that just goes through parts of a sunken audience. This is very traditional for kabuki. Staging was designed so that actors were very involved with their audience. Probably the thing that we most associate with kabuki, though, is the makeup. Characters were made up with severe, exaggerated expressions on their face to accentuate certain character traits. Characters in kabuki shows weren't just people, those characters were personifications of large concepts or emotions or of characteristics. One's character doesn't just feel rage, they become rage itself, or suffering, or whatever other emotion or concept. But that starts to move somewhat into the style of kabuki, and while style's a lot of fun, we're here to talk history. So rather than taking a look at the art form, and rather than taking a look at what's going on the stage, I want us to ask that all-important question of, what was everybody else doing? So don't take a look at the stage right now, look briefly at the audience. As I do with a number of the lecture videos, I'm going to toss this one over to you all. I'll point out a few things, and I'm going to want you to draw some conclusions about them when we talk about kabuki in class in a few days' time. So take a look at the audience. We see people in the sunken-in seats. Well, actually, it doesn't look like there are any seats there at all to me, so that's something else that we should try to extrapolate from. We see people in some box seats off to the side, including some that are elevated above the rest. And we see some people, some waitstaff, walking around with food and tea, which is a good thing too, because a short kabuki show would be a 6 to 7 hour long affair. Kabuki was an all-day or sometimes even multiple day event. Given that we see a large audience, and given that we see multiple seating options, and given that these people are making a day out of this, what does kabuki reveal about the nature of economic classes in Japan in the 17th centuries? Think about it and tell me what you think in class when we see this picture again. or just like, blurt it out in the halls whenever you see me. That's it for this show. Unlike Kabuki, I'll keep it well under 6 hours. Although, much like Kabuki, I've been doing this whole thing covered in makeup. I'll see y'all in class. Make sure to Spartan up.